Hello, welcome to The Fire These Times. My name is Justin Salhani, and I'll be guest hosting today. With me is Yasser Elsheshtawy. Hi, Yasser. Why don't you give us a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. I am adjunct professor at Columbia University, Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, or GSAPP. And I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, D.C. Before that, I was a professor of architecture at the United Arab Emirates University, where I taught from 1997 up until 2017. Close to 20 years at the School of Architecture there. And I'm originally from Egypt, but have decided after I completed or felt that I stayed long enough in the Gulf region to return to the United States. And I've been here since 2017.
Great. I first came across your work because of a concept that you've popularized and coined called Dubaization. Recently, I think this term has become more and more prevalent and also more and more relevant in terms of trying to break down how cities are building and in terms of potentially plans for the Middle East. Could you, as well, I should add, as well as beyond the Middle East. But I'm wondering, could you start off maybe by, for those who are not familiar, could you share with us an explanation of Dubaization and how you came to coin this term?
Right. So back in 2004, when I was in the UAE, Dubai was sort of beginning to really make its mark on the world. There were these countless media articles talking about all these different projects that are being built, particularly the Palm Island, which was introduced at the turn of the 21st century. And there was Burj Al Arab and the Emirates Towers and all of these different projects. So they were really making a very strong impact on the urban discourse, on any discussion related to urbanization and cities, and particularly in the Middle East. And I'm from Egypt, and I felt that there was this really very strong influence of this Dubai urban model on developments that were taking place in Egypt around that time. And there were a couple of projects that I began to look at more closely in Cairo, a smart village, for example, which was really inspired by Dubai Internet City. And then there were projects that were directly sort of impacted or put in place by Emirati actors, developers such as Amar. And one of those projects is Uptown Cairo. And of course, Uptown Cairo is an exclusive gated community located on the Muqattam mountain in Cairo and overlooking one of the largest slums in Egypt, perhaps in the world, Sheikh Nasser, home to millions of people. So I felt that there was this strong influence of Dubai on Egypt, but then I looked at the wider Middle East region, and I felt that there was there were all these urban developments that were directly inspired by Dubai. We've seen this in Tunis, in Morocco, in Syria prior to the civil war there, in Amman, and arguably what is happening in Dubai works in Dubai. You know, it's a very specific context within which these projects take place. But when you look at the broader Arab region, it's quite problematic because you have a very different social structure. There is great inequality among the population. So when you begin to introduce these Dubai-inspired projects, it can be quite problematic in terms of the overall social structure. So I felt that this term Dubaization sort of captures that impact and that influence and a particular mode of development, one that relies on real estate speculation, and one that is based on a sort of tabula rasa approach whereby you erase existing developments and replace them with newer structures. And of course, it's not really, this is not necessarily a Dubai invention. In fact, we see this throughout the world, and the broader term is neoliberal urbanization. It's just that Dubai has become sort of the poster child for implementing this kind of model in the region. And this continues till this day.
I'd like to come back to that in a little bit and talk about, you know, how you said that Dubaization is, and this sort of neoliberal urbanism is imposed on different cities. But recently I thought of you because Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, promoted a plan for the future of Gaza. And I saw that you had posted on your Instagram account kind of the same thing. So it was one of these moments where as you were posting it, I was thinking about it through the terms that you had used to describe the larger phenomenon. I'm wondering if you've taken a look at that plan, or at least the images for it, and what can you say about that? You know, what would it mean for Gaza and Palestinian society at large to turn Gaza, as Netanyahu is saying, into this kind of free trade zone that might have links to places like Neom and Abu Dhabi and Dubai? And what would that mean for Palestinian society as well as the future of Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, it's when I saw that article, it was published, I think, it was published in the Times of Israel, is an Israeli outlet, and it contained this image of skyscrapers in Gaza overlooking the Mediterranean. And an Emirati political commentator said that this will be financed and developed by Emirati UAE-based developers. And there's really no surprise there. I mean, we have seen that in other parts of the region where Emirati developers go in and begin to implement that particular mode of development that they are using in the Gulf. So it's I mean, at the face of it, it's all good. But then, of course, you have to think about what this kind of development is actually replacing. And it is replacing Gaza, a city home to millions of people, comprised of various urban centers. All of those have been obliterated and demolished by the IDF, the Israeli army. And the objective, everybody knows that, is to completely erase any trace of Palestinian existence in that part of the world, and according to these plans, to redevelop it into a high-end, exclusive zone for wealthy individuals, and they could be Palestinians, wealthy individuals, investors from elsewhere, and perhaps even become a place for laundering money. But then the impact, of course, on Palestinian societies, because many aren't really going anywhere. They are right now in refugee camps in Rafah. And for the majority of them, they will have no place in a development like that, in exclusive development. They will be relegated to slums that will be probably built outside of these exclusive centers. And that in turn will increase inequality, exacerbate inequality, lead to all sorts of various problems. But the Israeli objective would have been achieved by removing the last vestiges of Palestinian resistance, and UAE developers will make a lot of money selling these units to investors. So that's really quite tragic and problematic, and there are no further details about this plan, and it may just be that, just sort of an image, a desire to have that sort of urban presence. But my sense is that this will actually move forward. And in fact, when you look at other parts of Palestine, in the West Bank, for example, there is a development called Rawabi, which is an exclusive high-end residential gated community in the West Bank that is surrounded by a fence and overlooked by various Israeli settlements, but it is built by a Palestinian developer and financed by Qatari investors from the Gulf. And it is home to Palestinians, but obviously wealthy Palestinians, those who can afford to live there. And it is not necessarily one that caters to the everyday needs of Palestinians in that part of the world. So it's I suppose these kind of developments can be looked at as another form of urban violence, whereby severe changes are inflicted upon societies with the aim of replacing low-income citizens and removing them out of urban centers, and instead having these high-end urban developments.
I think your point, about particularly relating this towards Gaza is interesting, because Gaza is the largest, or I mean, was the largest continuous area of land where Palestinians lived. Obviously the Israelis have in the last 7 to 8 months pushed in and occupied part of that land, at least militarily for the time being, though we're still not sure what the day after will look like. And personally, when I saw, having the awareness of that, and then seeing this plan, and like you said, there's still very few details about it other than maybe a few images shared to the world. And Netanyahu is quite famous for sharing, big special images in public settings.
Right.
But terms that come to mind include things like politicide, herbicide, domicide, the destruction of Palestinian political awareness, political ideology, political history, domicide in the sense of like places where Palestinians live. Because as you mentioned, a lot of these new kind of flashy buildings and developments are not necessarily built for social cohesion. When I think about Dubai in particular, and I think about the way the city is structured, of course, there's a weather element, that being in large parts of the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf, it's hard to be outdoors in summer months because of the extreme heat. But cities have been also built in a way where you don't tend to have a lot of public spaces. You don't have spaces where people can kind of interact across classes and maybe in public areas. I want to kind of carry that into another thought, which is that when I look at the way people interact with their cities, I might make an argument, and I'd be interested to hear what you think here, that Dubaization, even beyond an urban aspect, has spread well into the world at large. And of course, this might be more in the neoliberal thread that you had touched upon. But what I mean by that is, for example, in Beirut, where I spend a lot of time and have family roots from, a lot of newer buildings, for example, don't necessarily have balconies anymore. And a lot of that is because people want to build their apartments in ways that maybe have, kind of glass windows that they can open. So they might have like extensions in their apartments. But it's also like it changes the social factor, right? There might be issues related to weather or traffic or pollution and things of that nature. But there's also a social element. And now, in the way that we interact with our homes, a lot of what we do might, when we come home in the evening, might be things related to watching Netflix, being on TV, being online. We're digitally connected. And it's led to, in some ways, and it varies from place to place, kind of an erosion of collectivity, of human connection, of interacting with one another.
Right.
It felt like, if we're talking maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a trade-off when we talked about like the issue of, let's say, Dubai particularly. A lot of people from around the world would potentially go to Dubai. I mean, for a while, there was lots of money to be made, as it was this expanding city. But there was a trade-off. Sometimes people would say, listen, I'm going because there's a level of stability, and maybe I come from a place where there wasn't that much stability. But there was also a trade-off of like, you're going to a place where it is an autocracy. There is, there are parts of there is no political representation. There are no human rights organizations. There is no political activity in the sense of like being able to engage. There is no naturalization, at least not in the sense of having normal pathways to nationalization. And that used to be a trade-off that people might make, let's say, reluctantly. Whereas it seems to me more and more that this is becoming kind of the norm, that, you know, it became to a point where Dubai has become a place where large parts of society are eager and willing to go make that trade-off. And it's almost spread outside, even in political senses, where, you know, I've had numbers of conversations with people who would say, listen, if I can choose between the stability of Dubai versus the instability of Beirut and autocracy versus democracy, I'll choose autocracy. And I think that's, you know, a very, let's say, baseline analysis that misses a lot of underlying important factors. But what I want to come to here is that, you know, I'm wondering if you've seen how that concept of the trade-off for moving to a place that is maybe more autocratic has become less of a thing that becomes impinging to people. People are more willing to make that deal, especially as their own countries possibly become less democratic or less representative, or they feel less politically connected to the spaces around them and less connected to the communities around them. I've just kind of rambled on a bit here, but I want to give you a chance to maybe respond to some of the few things that I've said, if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, these are really very interesting observations, and I think you're quite true in stating that. And in this whole idea of public space as a place of political discourse, and there are many thinkers and observers who have talked about that. Jürgen Habermas talked about public space, you know, the space of political expression. We can go back in history to the Greek agora, you know, the at the foot of the Acropolis, where there was a market and people exchanged political ideas freely, and where democracy was born. And many would argue that this is sort of an ideal image that really doesn't exist anymore. And when we look at a place like Dubai, for example, there is indeed a trade-off. And in fact, when you ask people, young people in particular in the Arab world, what is their ideal city? Where would you like to live? Inevitably, the answer will be Dubai. And the attraction points is that it is clean, it is safe, you make a relatively comfortable living. There are all these sort of venues of entertainment. So really, who cares about freedom and democracy and being able to express yourself freely? But then, of course, there is a trade-off, because it sort of impacts your quality of life, your sense of a free-thinking human being. And this is one of the reasons why I left the region. I've lived in the UAE for close to 20 years, relatively free. I mean, I could write, and there really was no fear of any sort of repercussions. But then after the Arab Spring, I felt that there was a change in attitude, that there was more scrutiny directed at academics and writers and people who have blogs online and so on. And I know of many colleagues who have been let go from my university where I worked. And I felt that if I continue on my sort of research that was quite critical of what is happening in Dubai, that I might be next. So that's one of the reasons why I left, because I felt that this ability to speak freely was seriously diminished. And I couldn't even go out anymore with my camera and take pictures, because inevitably there will be some security or police person that will stop me and ask me what I'm doing. So there is this trade-off, and you see that in various parts of the world. It's not just in the UAE, even in places like the United States, in New York, there is this sort of diminishing ability to really express yourself freely, and there are all these different developments that are taking place that that primarily aim at having a profit. Developments like Hudson Yards in New York, for example. But then these are like, and not necessarily the predominant mode of urban development. It's quite small compared to the rest of New York, and there are still possibilities for political discourse in public space. It is ultimately at the end still a democracy, even if it is flawed. But in the Gulf region and in places where there are these autocratic regimes, public space is looked at with suspicion, and all efforts are made to minimize gathering in public spaces. However, even in a place like Dubai, there are always these exceptions, and that's something that I've looked at, where there are these hidden spaces that are populated by migrants, where they come together, they gather, and they sort of establish a counter narrative to what is taking place elsewhere in the city. And I think it's these places that offer some sort of hope, and they show that city residents have an ability to resist and to subvert these various oppressive measures that are taking place in their respective cities.
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting point, and you see that this kind of organic life comes out of these spaces. How do you think the existence of such spaces, because obviously the way that the Gulf tends to work, and I'm speaking at large, while every country will have their intricacies and differences. Typically, you can go, you get a sponsor, and you're able to work, and you stay there for a certain period of time. Of course, that sponsorship system, at least historically, and again based on the country, there might be kind of a hierarchy depending on where you're coming from in the world, what nation, how powerful your passport is, things of that nature. And then usually by the time of retirement or something of that, sometime around there, you're expected to leave and return to your country of origin, or at least to go somewhere else. Do you see any possibility in these spaces? How are these communities of migrants changing these cities, and what sort of impact can that have on the future, do you think?
Yeah, so that's quite interesting point. The sponsorship system, that's the kafala system, right? And basically, if you get a job, you need to be sponsored by the person offering you the job. So that's very basically the concept behind that. And that has changed over the last few years, particularly after the pandemic. When in places like Dubai, many people left and felt that this is not a viable way of living, that you are there basically till you are 60, and that's the age of retirement, and then you just being asked to return to wherever you came from. And of course, by that point, you would have spent your entire working life in the Gulf, and if you return back to your home country, you will be a stranger there. So they changed that, and they have now instituted golden visas, where you get a kind of semi-permanent residency. It's, I think, a 10-year visa. It's predicated on a number of factors: your level of education, your income, etc. But by and large, the vast majority of workers, and low-income workers in particular, don't really have the possibility for that. They are still very much reliant on a 3-year visa that is being offered, and then every 3 years you have to undergo a medical examination. They check for HIV and other illnesses, and if you have are afflicted by any of that, you are basically deported. So there is this sense of temporariness, and I've talked about this in my book, Temporary Cities, that this is really the overall approach to urban governance in the Gulf and in places like Dubai. But then there is this kind of resistance, and these places that I just mentioned, these places where people come together and gather, where a kind of urbanity takes place. There is a certain liveliness, and people meet their compatriots and exchange news and even political views about what is going on in their country, and even in places like the UAE. That shows that there is a certain resilience and desire to subvert this sense of temporality and establish a sort of permanence in their living conditions. It is, of course, short-lived, but it nevertheless is there. But I think for countries in the Gulf, if looking at the future and realizing that oil will not last forever, and looking at other issues such as climate change and so on, that they need to change their approach towards looking at these workers. It's not simply a matter of importing workers and having them do all these menial works that locals are unwilling to do, and then get rid of them and replace them with other people from elsewhere. That needs to change to really have any viable path forward. Otherwise, I don't really see how these cities can survive in the long term. And Saudi writer Abdurrahman Munif called these cities in the Gulf cities of salt, because when he was asked about the title of his book, why he called it that, he said that cities in the Gulf are are almost as if they are built from salt. And whenever there is flood or water, it will simply wash away all these marvelous edifices and towers that are being built. He didn't mean it literally, but basically at the sign of any trouble, of any crisis, all of these cities will simply not be able to continue in the way that they have been up until that point.
It's interesting you say that, because we're just coming off in the last couple of months, if I'm not mistaken, massive floods in Dubai, maybe for the first time ever, where you had, I don't think difficulties with infrastructure is necessarily something new with a lot of the workers that come from, South Asia and parts of East Asia in the past necessarily, but this is something that also hit middle and upper class residents of Dubai. And it's interesting, because I've spoken with academics that focus on the Gulf before, and one of the big kind of appeals, I guess, is in let's say in cities like Dubai in particular, is this kind of sense that you're insulated from everything around the world. And I think that kind of, for a number of people, maybe broke that perception a little bit. Based on that, a little while ago, I read the book, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this one, Spaceship in the Desert by Gökçe Günel.
Yes.
It's about the attempt to create what is essentially the world's first zero carbon city called Masdar City. It was looked over by the guy who later was the president of COP28, Sultan Al-Jaber. And she wrote a book about this. And there was one anecdote from that I found very interesting. And this will take us into the next point that I'd like to tap on a little bit here. Masdar City was supposed to be the city of the future in so many ways. But in a lot of ways, while there were, I think, and I think the jury is still out on whether it was a success or not. And I think today they're talking about turning it into a place for certain businesses to rent offices or something of that nature. It's not become a livable place the way that maybe it was first intended. But there was an interesting anecdote from it, because this whole city was, it was a spaceship in the desert. It was off there in the desert. It was not accessible by public transportation, which tends to be quite difficult in much of the Gulf already. And it was this big spectacle. It was a big show that didn't always run super fluidly. And there was one anecdote in particular where, the Gulf has plenty of sunshine typically. And so one of the ideas in this city that was supposed to be, zero carbon, completely renewable, or with clean technology and renewable energy and things of that nature, they put out solar panels. The issue was that the solar panels, because it was in the middle of the desert, kept getting covered in sand. And so they asked, in this marvelous, spectacular city of the future, how do you solve an issue where sand is covering solar panels? And the solution here was, quote unquote, I'm quoting from the book here, man with brush. It was essentially they hired, one of these laborers coming from South Asia to just every few hours or few minutes to go out and just manually brush off in the extreme heat and the extreme conditions, brush off the solar panels. And I find that interesting because in a city where you're supposed to be, exploring the spectacular in the future and having all these innovative ideas, I think it shows two things. One, that you're still going to rely on human labor, and that human labor will still be in extreme conditions. And two, that was the solution in a place that there's supposed to be this incredible amounts of imagination. Like you mentioned, post-Arab Spring, being in conditions where it's really difficult to even walk down the street and take pictures, it makes it difficult to think, to reflect, to do research. That's not just a way that a city is built. It's also lends itself to imagination, to political imagination, to creative imagination. And I'm wondering if we can take this Dubaization idea into, the shrinking of political spaces. Of course, this is connected to wider trends within neoliberalism at large in our global economy. But I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to, as we've seen these ideas of the spectacle grow, especially in cities like Cairo and Beirut, how have you seen political imagination evolve or shrink?
Yeah. So regarding that spaceship in the desert, I mean, obviously, I know Gökçe. She really has done a remarkable job in documenting the development of the city of Masdar. That, as you said, I mean, it changed quite considerably from this idealized version of a zero carbon, zero energy city to something that is much more generic and sort of a very conventional real estate development at this point. But going back to your point, you talked about the floods, and then of course this idea of the man with the brush cleaning the solar panels. Obviously, when the floods hit Dubai, I mean, they were quite severe and would have impacted any city, but they nevertheless showed the vulnerability of what has been built in Dubai so far, and the extent by which the city really cannot insulate itself from external influences forever. And that when it comes to the floods, ultimately the ones who were actually doing the cleanup were the workers. And there were many images of workers driving around with trucks, absorbing all the water that has been accumulated. And the ones living in villas and so on maybe were inconvenienced for a day or two, but then thanks to the workers, their life went back to normal. We cannot say that about the workers. So ultimately, I think your question was about the extent of how that impacted political expression or freedom. Was that what you were asking?
I mean, yes, but I think also in terms of imagination, what I mean by that is, where do we see the possibilities of politics, right? Like, what do we think are reasonable things that we can do as individuals that lead to change, or that we can do as communities that lead to change? Maybe I could expand on that just briefly, because it feels like, we talked about how living the sort of lifestyle that doesn't have the public space, and without the public space, whether it's, like I said, a balcony or a public square where, or playgrounds where kids can play that are not just blocked off for certain classes, but that lead to cross-pollination amongst classes, amongst nationalities, amongst people, amongst neighborhoods, amongst many different things, right? What we see, and I don't think this is exclusively to Dubai, actually. I think more and more in cities around the world, we're seeing community kind of break down, and there's a number of reasons for that. And isolation, loneliness is an epidemic. A few years ago, I thought about this because I had fallen into community in a few different times in my life, kind of by chance. And then I felt when I had moved or been pulled out of it, or if it had broken apart, this kind of intense loneliness. And I remember I Googled it, and I saw like pages and pages of academic articles of research on how loneliness is an epidemic. And I don't think that you can necessarily disconnect, how our societies are built, how our cities are built from loneliness and isolation. And so what I'm wondering is, like, as we create these societies, like you mentioned, that are serving, and maybe it's fair to say, like, serving the spectacle over thinking about public good in a way, how does that minimize our political imagination? How does that make us think that the options that we have are limited, that are maybe sometimes our stress, anxiety, our sadness, our isolation are our own fault? It's individual rather than collective. And we're not maybe aware or we've never experienced even the possibility of having communities. I'm not sure if I've made that super clear, but has that kind of, I don't know if that's jogged your...
No, absolutely. And I think like all of these things that you're talking about, they came like that, they were sort of intensified, and they became very much part of the general discussion about urbanism and cities. That happened during and after the pandemic, when people were locked in their homes and really felt isolation and loneliness. And the only way to sort of overcome that was to begin to explore their surroundings, the small neighborhood parks that exist next to their places where they live, the streets, the small shops and restaurants and so on, to simply go out and begin to encounter their fellow citizens. That was something that wasn't or people didn't feel that they needed that prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic sort of brought that into view. So that's one thing. The other one is that really to sort of begin to point out first of all the criticality of loneliness, and that it is an epidemic, and that it impacts people's physical well-being and their health and their mental health, is to public participation, to encourage communities to come together, to voice their views, and to be able to express their objection or approval of developments that are taking place. And that obviously is part of the planning process in any democratic or free society. In places like the Arab world, like the Gulf in particular, autocracies, public participation is not part of the equation. In fact, people are looked at as being kind of a nuisance, and they need to be sidestepped, and other stakeholders need to be taken into account. So that obviously is quite problematic, and I'm not really seeing, when you look at what's happening in the Arab world, places like Egypt, Tunisia, there are the space for freedom and the space to express yourself freely has shrunk considerably. Even in a place like Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring, which had some promise in terms of freedom and proliferation of various NGOs and community organizations. Now that freedom has been restricted, and it's returning to more restricted modes of governance. In other parts, we see an obliteration of societies in places like Yemen or Sudan, which is currently has the civil war. And inevitably, when you look even in Egypt and Tunisia, the ones who are actually behind the curtailment of freedom is the UAE. They are the ones who are sponsoring one faction in Sudan. They were part of the Yemen campaign. They are the ones supporting the regime in Egypt, and so on. So it's this mode of this notion of Dubaization. It's not just about fancy towers and so on. It's also a mode of governance and a way of ruling societies and making sure that the voices of the marginalized and the voices of the marginalized are not being heard. So I think that's quite problematic, and really the only way to overcome that is for people to come together, to resist, and to make their voices heard.
I think that's such a great way of putting it, because you're right. I think it goes way beyond, like you said, putting up fancy buildings. It's a means of soft power and sometimes hard power.
Right.
Here in France, where I am currently, the UAE has made big efforts. They're not the only, let's say, state or actor that's been trying to make inroads politically, but the UAE has made big pushes in a number of fronts, including with elected officials, but also there's I saw an advertisement a few months ago for a French language magazine that is just entirely about the UAE, and you have shows on television, like reality shows about people from France that go and live in the UAE and Dubai and have these kind of glorious, luxurious lives. There's a sense here that the same way that we describe youth in the Arab world seeing Dubai as kind of glamorous and ideal city, there's a sense of that among certain communities here as well, which I find quite interesting. You mentioned, because I would like to maybe end on something, hopeful or ways that we can counter this sort of erosion of rights, this incremental autocracy. And you said, organizing, collectivizing. A lot of that has happened recently on college campuses. We've seen protests around the world. A lot of this is built around the issue of Gaza and seeking a ceasefire in Palestine. But I've also noticed that a lot of the discourse coming out of these various protest movements has stretched beyond that. Obviously, these movements are wide and diverse and contain a lot of different elements, and some of those might be problematic, and some can be quite inspiring. I'm wondering, how do you see that we can move forward? Are some of these movements that are happening now, do you think these could be a platform for this kind of coming together to stand up to these wider forces? And I might just add, do you also think that, with the idea that the UAE has been behind a lot of this, so not exclusively, I think this is a wider force and phenomenon. How, can we not disconnect Emirati Israeli normalization from this phenomenon as well? I may have asked two kind of different things there, but feel free to answer how you like.
Yeah. So the first point about these protest movements, obviously, that has been something at the forefront here in the US. And I think it exposed, not just in the US, even in Europe, it exposed all the hypocrisy of regimes here, claiming that they are championing human rights and rule of law. And then they just simply stand by and watch and aid the genocide that is happening in Gaza and Palestine. And this echoes similar modes of resistance that took place in the US. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement that was happening a few years ago. It led to some attempts at police reform. But then ultimately what happens is that these there is a way here for regimes in like even democratic regimes to sort of absorb these movements, to sort of normalize it in a way, and it ultimately kind of like fizzles away and not much really happens. The hope is that as these movements grow and continue, that ultimately it will lead to real change. But that really hasn't happened so far. So that's I think one point. The other one about normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE. Obviously, the UAE and Israel have been in close contact even before the Abraham Accords. There were close collaborations, particularly in matters of security between Abu Dhabi and Israel. And in fact, the ruler of Abu Dhabi employed the services of an Israeli security firm to install various modes of various ways of monitoring the movement of citizens and expatriates. The program was called Eagle Eye, and that was implemented by an Israeli security agency. So that collaboration continues. And it's the UAE that is at the forefront of this, and they obviously attempt to bring other countries into that agreement as well, such as Saudi Arabia, but that obviously hasn't happened yet. But the UAE is continuing, and it serves its interest. And that is another part of what is happening in the UAE, is that it is able to take advantage of these various crises and to monetize them and to make profit. And that has been the case now for decades. And I don't see this changing in any way in the near future.
Great. Is there anything that keeps you hopeful for the future as a means of resisting these forces and what seems to be like a collaboration of, autocrats and illiberal regimes and ideologies?
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's very easy to just succumb to pessimism and sort of hopelessness. But when we look at what is happening in the region, places like Egypt, for example, there are these subtle modes of resistance. There are these different community organizations and slums that are trying to create a certain degree of change in their overall living conditions, something that is informal, that does not rely on the government, and where people simply are taking matters into their own hand. And we see that also in the Gulf, in Bahrain, for example. And I think also in the UAE to some extent, these spaces that I have documented that are sort of safe havens for migrants where they come together away from the scrutinizing eyes of authorities. All of that shows that people have agency and there is a certain resilience and that they are able to overcome these harsh circumstances. So that gives some glimmer of hope. And even among citizens in the UAE, there are many now who are calling for a change in governance, of giving more permanent status to the various expatriates who are working in the Gulf, to recognize them not just as people who are executing certain tasks, but also as contributing to the well-being of the societies that they live in. They are contributing to the wealth, they are building the towers, they are managing traffic and driving metro trains and all of that. So there is a change of attitude. It's subtle, but it's there. And I think that sort of gives one a little bit of hope.
Wonderful. Before we go, we'd like to ask you for 3 books you can recommend. And I'm sorry to do this, but I'm going to spring something on you as well, because in last September, I had the opportunity to sit in on one of your classes. And you for your semester, you were showing a number of different films that depict different elements of Arab cities, and I believe it was Cairo and Beirut that you were showing at the time. So if you could suggest us 3 books and maybe throw in, if not too last minute, maybe a film or 2 as well that you think has inspired you.
Yeah. Regarding books, and there's one book I just mentioned a while ago, Cities of Salt, by a Saudi writer, Abdurrahman Munif, and translated by Peter Theroux. It's a part of a 5-part series, and it depicts the changes that happens in a fictional Arab country. It's basically Saudi Arabia, and the impact of oil and how that impacted life in that part of the world. It's really a wonderful introduction if you want to learn about the Arabian Peninsula. The other book, not really related to that, but it's by the Sudanese writer Tayyip Saleh, called Season of Migration to the North. And it's about a Sudanese student who returns from the UK to Sudan. And it's about colonialism, post-colonialism, and I think it's really wonderful as well. And then the third one would be by Jane Jacobs, an American writer who wrote really a classic book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, really pointing out the importance of community, of street life, and the destructive impact of modernizing architecture and urban planning. So I think it's really sort of reading this as like a wake-up call. Regarding movies, I think like a key movie that I show in my seminar is by director Tamer Saeed, and the main actor was Khaled Abdallah, called In the Last Days of the City. It's about Cairo, but specifically downtown Cairo, and the changes that happened there prior to the Arab Spring. There is a sort of a sense of nostalgia, and it doesn't just talk about Cairo, it also talks about Beirut and Baghdad, the destructive impact of war and urban violence, and how to make sense of all that. So I think it's really wonderful. And yeah, so these would be my suggestions.
Great. I actually read Season of Migration, I think 3 weeks ago. It was the first time I picked it up. So that's a timely one for me. Great. Yeah. Yasser, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It was great having you on.
Yeah, sure, Justin. And thanks for having me. It was very enjoyable, very pleasurable.
This has been another episode of the Fire These Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. And if you really like this podcast, head on to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem based in the periphery that supports a bunch of media projects, including this one. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Khida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care, everyone.